Part of the statistical process that we've seen earlier had to do with organizing and summarizing our data. This chapter is about organizing data in two of the three ways that you see here on the screen. We want to organize data into both tables and graphs, and that's the focus of chapter 2. Now, this particular section we are currently looking at is going to deal only with organizing qualitative data. So that would be that categorical type data that we've defined earlier. And we want to be able to organize that data, or in other words, organize the raw data that we've been looking at. So tables and graphs is how we're going to discuss it in this chapter. And then in the next chapter, chapter 3, we'll talk about numerical summaries and so forth. So let's start by looking at a data set together. In this particular data set, I have results from a survey that was conducted. And in the leftmost column here are the results from my Spring 24 survey. And in the second column here are the results from all of the surveys that I've given. I believe this goes back all the way to 2019. And in this particular question, I was asking students to just decide whether they would say that they would, whether they would consider themselves Republican, Independent, or Democrat. And if we only focus on this leftmost column here, and if I scroll down in all of this data, these are the results of the survey. Now, if I wanted to get a sense of what that data is, in other words, approximately how much of, or how many of the people said that they were Republican, how many said they were independent and Democratic. The way that the data is given here in this column, in the leftmost column, is not going to be the easiest way for me to display that information. So another way for us to be able to kind of summarize what we call this raw data here is to take it and put it into a table. So to do a table in StatCrunch, we're going to go here to Stat, Tables, Frequency. I'm going to choose the political party column, and I want to count up how many of the respondents from the survey answered that they were a particular political party. So we're going to select frequency, and I'm just going to hit compute. Let's see what we get. So here you can see I have a table. Now this table is what we call a frequency table, in that it is a count of each one of the categories that we're looking at. Remember that in response to this question, which political party would you say that you belong to, there's only 3 responses that could be given. All of those responses are qualitative responses. So this is obviously a qualitative variable. And in other words, they're categorized into Democrat, Republican, and Independent. So a frequency table is going to give me the frequency with which the category was answered. So it's the total count for each one of these categories. You can look here and you can see that there were a total of 6 respondents who said they were Democratic, 27 said that they were independent, and 16 of them said that they were Republican. And the total count for the party, or the total count for the survey, was 49. So this is what we would call a frequency table. If I wanted to compare, let's say, the results from my spring survey to the results of all of my surveys for the past several years, I could also do a frequency table for the second column. So let's go back in, and I'm going to add that column to this table that we were looking at. So I'm going to click on Options, Edit, because I just want to add the next column over. So political party total is the one I'm going to choose here. And I'm going to still leave it as a frequency. So now what we see would be the top table is telling me the frequency for my current semester's results. The second table down here is telling me the results for all of my surveys from 2019. And you can see, of course, that we have more respondents for Democrat, Independent, and Republican in the second table. Well, that would make sense. There were 311 people who in total have taken the survey versus the 49 people who've taken it this semester. But what if I wanted to compare the Democrat, like I wanted to compare one semester to the total semester. So maybe I want to know, have I had more people claiming to be Democratic this semester than what I normally see over all of my semesters? It's going to be difficult for me to compare the two tables to each other or the two categories to each other unless I change them into some sort of percentage. The reason for that is because the first table represents only 49 people. The second table represents 311 total people. So if I wanted to say that there were 6 out of 49 Democrats from the spring, compared to 85 out of 311 from the total respondents, that's really a hard comparison to make because their total numbers are not the same. The way that we go about comparing things that are not the same or that don't have the same total values is to change it into a decimal or a percent. So let's go back and let's now create a table. And we're going to do it just because I want to keep talking about the two comparisons here. So I want to do a table now for both the current semester of political party and the total semesters. But this time I want to add to my table the relative frequency count. And we'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. So this time we still have my table, my frequency table here. So remember, this middle column is telling me the total number of people who responded to Democratic, Independent, and Republican for both the current semester and the total. But we've added a column over here called relative frequency. And this is going to be the decimal value or the proportional value for each one of the categories. So there were, and remember, we can change a decimal into a percent by moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So in the current semester, we might say that there were approximately 12% of the students who responded Democrat, 55% of the students responded Independent, and 32% of the students responded, or 33, I should say, responded that they were Republican. Now I can compare percentages from this semester to my total semester's worth of teaching, and I can see that in all semesters of asking this particular question, we had 27% of the students responded that they were Democratic versus 12% of the current students responding that they were Democratic. So in other words, if I just want to compare the two categories to each other, I've got to change it into a relative frequency to be able to make that comparison. And the reason for that is because their total respondents are different. The total number of people from this semester versus all my semesters is obviously going to be different. So here we're talking about creating a table for summarizing and displaying the information that I've collected here in my survey. Along with a table, we said that we can also organize this information into some sort of a graph. So for a graph of qualitative variables, we're going to choose a bar graph. So I come up here to graph. StatCrunch calls it a bar plot, and I have two choices. I can choose with data or with summary. We're going to choose with data because the column that's representing the results from this political party question hasn't already been summarized. It's the actual raw data. It's just nothing's been done with it. It was just the data as it was collected, and so we're going to choose the with data option. Political party, we're not going to do the second column. I'm going to choose political party and I'm going to leave it alone and I'll just hit compute. So here is now a bar graph that's representing the three categories for the possible political affiliations. And then the height of each one of the bar graphs is going to represent the frequency within that category. So you can see here, remember we're talking about the top table over here on the right. The height of this bar, this is the graphical display of the results from the spring semester survey. So I can see that there were a total of 6 people that responded that they were that claimed that they were in the Democratic Party, and that corresponds over here with my frequency value in the table. So my bar graph then becomes a picture representing the table that I have over here. Now we know if we can represent information using a frequency in a table, I can also represent that that data in a relative frequency in a table as well. We can do the same thing in a bar graph. So I'm going to move this graph off to the side over here. I'm going to go back in to graph, bar plot with data, and I'm going to repeat the process of creating a bar graph for political party, but this time I want to choose a relative frequency bar graph. I'm not going to do anything else. There's going to be no grouping. I'm not going to change anything else within this pop-up screen. I'm just going to hit compute. So here I have the relative frequency bar graph, and here I have just the frequency bar graph. Notice that there's really no difference between these two graphs. If I wanted to just talk about their shapes and their heights relative to each other, the graphs look exactly the same. The only way I can tell that there is a difference between them has to do with the left-hand side of the scale over here and that heading, which kind of states frequency and relative frequency. So understand that when I'm talking about graphically displaying my information, it doesn't make a difference if I have a frequency or a relative frequency graph, because the picture that's representing the data compared to each other in these categories is going to be the same. And just to note here that, again, if I were to hover my mouse over each one of these bars, I would know the height of the bar, which corresponds to the value of the bar or the proportion of each one of these categories. And we can look back on our table and we would see that, yes, there is 0.122 proportion or 12% Democrat respondents to this survey that we have taken. So what do we see here? We know that if I want to create a table to display my information, that's going to look like a frequency and a relative frequency table. And then graphically so far, we've looked at a bar graph for my qualitative data, and they're both going to look the same whether we use frequency or relative frequency. So let me kind of summarize that for you in this way. When we want to talk about a frequency distribution in a table, a frequency distribution is really just going to give me those number of occurrences for each of the categories we're looking at. So how many people responded Democratic, how many people responded independent, and so forth. A relative frequency distribution would be the proportion or percent of observations within that category. And we find that, we didn't talk about this a moment ago, but we find that by taking the total number for the frequency for each of the categories divided by all of the people who responded to the survey. So add up all of your values from your sample, and then that's the denominator, and then the frequency is going to be the frequency for each of the categories. And then finally, bar graphs. So the bar graph is the first type of a graphical display that we are considering here for our qualitative data. And our bar graph is going to be able to show us comparisons from one category to the next. That's an important thing to remember, and we'll keep emphasizing it as we move on. You'll notice that our categories don't matter the order that we place them in on the bar. I mean, on your horizontal axis, it doesn't matter whether I put Republican, Democrat, Independent, or maybe I put it alphabetical. It doesn't really matter for qualitative data. Your goal should be that you want to convey as much information about the data to in the kind of the smallest piece of time. So this is our introduction to organizing our qualitative data.